Hi everyone, good evening. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Huxley Lecture Theatre here at the ZSL, Zoological Society of London, for the first of a series of 6 special events that are all celebrating the zoo's 200th anniversary, its 200th birthday. My name's Adam Rutherford. I'm a scientist at UCL, I'm a broadcaster. The zoo is a very special place to me, as it is to so many people. I don't remember this, but I asked my dad this morning what our memories of going to the zoo were, and he took me to see Guy the gorilla when I was 3. I don't remember that because Guy died in 1978, but I've been coming to the zoo every year since then. I teach conservation biology students at UCL, and we do our assessments in this very lecture theatre. Some of them are here in the audience today. They give 10-minute talks, which I assess with 5 minutes questions. All of our speakers today will also be giving 10-minute talks with a Q&A afterwards, and I've asked my students to judge them on the quality of their scientific information, the design of their slides, and their presentation style. No, I am joking. I'm not. We're going to be hearing tonight about the background to science at ZSL. We're going to be looking at trailblazing pioneers over its 200 years. We're going to be hearing about some of the 3 most significant conservation projects which really are having a great impact from 3 researchers here at ZSL. And we're going to be hearing our own perspectives on the zoo, and in a Q&A that we're going to have afterwards. We've got questions in already, but we're going to start with our first presentation by not a member of ZSL, but a documentary maker, writer, storyteller, and the author of The Zoo, The Wild and Wonderful Tale of the Founding of London Zoo, where we're going to hear about some of that history that started 200 years ago right here on this spot. So please could you join me in welcoming to the stage Isobel Charman.
Hi everyone, yeah, I am definitely not a scientist to all the students in the room, and do not want to be assessed on my scientific, what I'm saying. I am, as Adam said, I suppose I'm a storyteller, and I'm here tonight because I had the huge privilege of digging into the ZSL's archives and to digging into the story of, how this all began 200 years ago. And, my job tonight is to take you back to that moment. And it's a story that begins here in London in 1826. And what does the world look like to us now? We're in the capital city of what's now a truly global empire. And, empire is really key to what we're going to see happen here. It's the most populous city in the world at this point. It's just reached 1 million. It's funny to think of now. And it's rapidly expanding and being sort of remodeled for this new imperial age. You can see the Regent's Park right on the tip. That's sort of recently been reclaimed from the countryside. Regent Street and Piccadilly Circus have just been built. Now Trafalgar Square and Buckingham Palace are underway. So it's, really being remodelled. And we're on the cusp of this huge revolution in terms of transport and communication. The railways are about to arrive. There's early experiments in photography. The telegraph is soon coming. So we're in this period of, we're really on the cusp of huge change. And I think if you were here, if we really were here in London in 1826, you'd feel it, you'd know that. And that sort of idea about, expansion and expanding horizons and exploration is also true in an intellectual sense. There's a real desire at this point to better understand the world that's being revealed in this age of, exploration and expansion. And what we see is people coming together to try and study it, to investigate certain aspects of it, to try and better understand it. And you'd had sort of learned societies before this point, the Royal Academy or the Royal Society, but they were very, very elitist institutions. And now what you see in the early 19th century is the creation of, smaller learned societies with kind of a specific focus. And You know, there's still very much a preserve of white privileged men, but we do see a sort of slight move towards meritocracy at this point. You know, sort of interested people who want to better understand what's going on. So we see the Horticultural Society, the Geological Society, and of course then we see the Zoological Society. And the person who set it up, I don't know if lots of you know this, but it was Stamford Raffles, who was very much a man of this age I've been speaking about, a man, you know, of empire. He was born into quite a humble family. He'd been a clerk for the East India Company, and he had spent years out in, you know, what was then called the East. He'd been governors in Indonesia, and he's probably best known for taking Singapore for the British. But the interesting thing for our purposes is that he was a very keen amateur naturalist. So whilst he was in the service of the East India Company and all these, you know, exotic places, he'd amassed a huge collection of living and preserved animals, and he wanted to better understand them. And so when he came back from his service, came back to London in 1824, he decided he was going to be the person to set up a zoological society to study these creatures that he was so interested in. And he set about recruiting members and, you know, drumming up support. And he came up with some early prospectuses. You know, he was the one that set what was this society going to be. And he said there were going to be a library, there was going to be a museum, but there was also, you know, what we all perhaps know it best for is to have a collection of living animals. And the key bit is really that these weren't going to be just for fun. These animals were going to be here to be studied, to help us understand the world that we lived in. Because there had been, this wasn't the first collection of exotic animals that there'd ever been. You know, there'd been menageries, there'd been, you know, these kind of places for amusement and entertainment, and there'd been kind of private royal collections of animals. But what was going to set Stamford Raffles' vision of this apart was that it was going to be scientific. And, you know, there was so much, you know, we talk about the advancement of zoological science. There was so much that wasn't understood at this point. You know, there was so much that wasn't understood about how humans worked, you know, let alone sort of how all these animals worked. And, you know, I include this picture. I'm taking real liberties here because this is much older than 1826. But at this point, there'd never been a giraffe seen in Europe in 1826. You know, and there was not photography, so people didn't really know what a giraffe looked like. And they were known as camel leopards, and it was presumed they were this sort of cross between camels and leopards, because that's how they'd heard them described. You know, of course, this is very much, we're talking from the context of Europe here, from Britain. Of course, people around the world knew what giraffes looked like, but people here, you know, really had no idea. So that's sort of the base point from which we're starting. You know, and the Zoological Society comes along and they want to understand the world. They want to describe all these animals, to name these animals, to know how they all fitted together. And it was actually pretty much 200 years ago that the ZSL was founded. I mean, the first big meeting was in April in 1826. But it was in February 1826 that Stamford Raffles gathered together the group of men he'd got involved in his project, and they met and they agreed to set up the Zoological Society of London. And one of the first things they were going to do was to take some land in Regent's Park to start building this collection of animals that he wanted. And here we see the Regent's Park at this point. And as an aside, Raffles actually wanted this little bit in the middle, but that was deemed, you know, he wasn't allowed that. There was a great deal of scepticism about what he was proposing, so he was given this little tranche out here in the corner, as we all know. And, you know, the Society was set up in 1826, and work began fairly quickly. In 1827, they were open to fellows of the Society and their guests in 1828, I think. And this is the gardens in 1829. You know, and you can see the first animals have come in, the first buildings are being built to house them. And I know I'm short of time, but I'm going to very quickly just show you some of the early things that we would have seen if we'd been visiting at this point. You know, some of you will recognise the clock tower from today. This was originally the llama house. We had the monkey house in 1829. A whole story about the battle to try and keep monkeys alive. It was a very, very steep and very heartbreaking learning curve. The first elephant arrived in 1831 called Jack. And then here we go. In 1836, in a much fanfare, the Zoological Society of London got its giraffes, and we can all see now what they really look like. You know, and how they acquired these giraffes is a crazy and, you know, kind of heartbreaking story again, that the word was put out around the empire that, to all the contacts around, British contacts around the globe, that they wanted to acquire some giraffes. And I think it was this guy on the right here, who was a trader in, I think he was in Malta or maybe it was Egypt. Anyway, he set out to go and find them, and he got some Egyptian hunters who, you know, hunted giraffes to come and help him actually just go and capture some giraffes, and they were brought back by steamship to London and sort of walked from the docks to the park, and it was this, you know, giraffe mania in London. You know, but we can see now that, you know, these aren't camel leopards. We can see, we've got giraffes now, we can see what they're actually like. But it does also illustrate the kind of tension that was there from the very beginning between, you know, the vulgar admiration that Stanford Raffles didn't want, because, you know, thousands of people rushed to see these giraffes, and they were a huge, huge spectacle. But, you know, they were also here then for the purposes of scientific study. You know, and interestingly, one of these giraffes died fairly soon after it arrived, and it was dissected, and, you know, this was the era of comparative anatomy, and this was probably the first time anyone had seen, you know, the inner workings of a giraffe as well. And one of the scientists who came to the giraffe house not long after this was Charles Darwin. And he'd recently returned from his trip on the Beagle, his trip round South America. He'd been a corresponding member of the society before he left, and when he came back, he, you know, made full use of all the different arms of the society and everything they had to offer. And I like to think that we know he went to visit the giraffe house in March 1838, you know, and I like to think he was asking some questions then about the giraffes, because famously, I mean, you know, Darwin wasn't the first person to come up with ideas of evolution. You know, there were ideas floating around that, you know, very controversial ideas, but that species weren't completely fixed, that, you know, maybe they did change over time. And a French naturalist had used the examples of giraffes' long neck to be that, you know, his theory was that individual giraffes stretched their necks as they tried to reach the leaves on trees, and they were then able to pass this longer neck onto their offspring. So, you know, there were some ideas about evolution at this point, but they were very controversial. But Darwin sort of had these in his mind when he came back from his trip. And as well as visiting the gardens, I'm sorry for the quality of this picture, it's the best I could find, but as well as visiting the gardens, he visited the museum of the ZSL, which was, you know, a hugely, supposedly equally important arm of the society at this point. And it was on Leicester Square in the 1830s, 28 Leicester Square. You know, very grand building. And the idea was that this museum would eventually have one of every species, a specimen of the entire animal kingdom in its collection. And all these, you know, adventurers and naturalists and naval people around the world would, you know, shoot and preserve animals that they found and send them back to the ZSL museum. And Darwin himself donated a huge collection of animals that he'd collected in South America to the museum. And the really interesting part of his collection, I mean, I'm sure some of you know about Darwin's finches. He had a bag of, you know, all these stuffed birds that he'd collected on his travels around the Galapagos. And he'd assumed that they were various different species, they looked really different. And he donated these stuffed animals to the Society's museum. And one of the experts, an ornithologist, had a look through them. And he said to Darwin, no, these aren't different species. These are all finches. They're just different. I mean, these are different species of finch, but they're all finches, and they've all adapted to the different islands that they were found on. I mean, I'd say I'm not a scientist, but, I hope you get the idea that, he could see that all these birds, had adapted to their different islands. And this was when the idea of sort of his theory of evolution started really to percolate. With thanks to the experts in the museum. And he also, as well as consulting with the experts in the museum, he also spent some time with one of the zoo's most famous inhabitants at this point, who was Jenny. She was called Jenny the orangutan. And she lived in the giraffe house alongside the giraffes because it was heated. And like I say, the society had a really tough time of keeping primates particularly alive at this point. But Darwin, once he'd, had this kind of, once the seed had been sown with the idea about his birds, that all these birds had changed, he kind of, these theories were percolating, and he consulted all the, different arms of the society. He spoke to the breeders about what they'd found about their animals. He spoke to the keepers. And he came and he spent a lot of time with Jenny, the orangutan, and he sort of carried out some rudimentary experiments on her, as in, could she use tools? Could she understand language? Could she, he gave her a mirror and she sort of kissed her reflection. And, this was for him really the last piece of the puzzle. He'd been having these ideas about species weren't fixed in this kind of divine order, this divine hierarchy, this idea that species actually adapted to their natural environments, to their distinct environments over time. And then with Jenny, it was, I suppose, the eureka moment, the last piece of the puzzle that actually, perhaps mankind was part of this kind of crazy, chaotic idea of adaptation. And after he visited Jenny, this was what he wrote in his notebook. Quite simply, he could see the link between humans and primates at this point. And this was by far the most controversial part of his theory. So controversial that he kept it to himself for 20 years, actually, really. And this is a note I'm going to end on. I'm conscious we're short of time, but when I set out researching this book, I found it's quite easy to imagine a city that didn't have trains or looked different or was much smaller. But I found it really, really hard to imagine a time when we didn't have the knowledge that we have now. To get beyond, pre the idea. It's an idea we take so for granted now, Darwin's theories. But to go back beyond that and to imagine, not having this knowledge and how we would acquire this knowledge, and I guess it makes me wonder sort of what we still don't know and what we don't even know we don't know. And on that note, I think it's probably best to hand over to people that are working in that and trying to find out exactly that.
Thank you, Izzy. That was a fascinating history. We all work as evolutionary biologists, as biologists in general, in the shadow of Darwin. So our next three speakers are all researchers here at ZSL, at the Institute of Zoology, and they're going to be talking about their individual projects in conservation. We are doing charismatic animals. We're doing cute animals in order. We're going to go frogs, seahorses, then badgers. Badgers, not badges. Okay, so if I could just introduce Ben Tapley here at ZSL. He's a specialist in, is it herpetology, reptiles and kind of herpetology, but it's reptiles and amphibians, and he is the leader of the first ever captive breeding of the critically endangered lake Oku frog and other aspects of frog biology. I'm just going to hand over to him to tell us about his frog projects.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So amphibian populations around the globe are going silent. There are over 9,000 different species of amphibian, and they're proportionately more threatened than other animal groups. So 41% of them are threatened with extinction. And if you take terrestrial vertebrates, those that are critically endangered, 50% of those are amphibians. And so we know they're in trouble. We've known they're in trouble for quite a long time. But what I find really alarming is just 1.6% of available conservation funding goes towards amphibians. And so here we're really fighting for the underdogs. And amphibians are really, really important. They often have aquatic larval phases. They're important for energy transfer between aquatic and terrestrial systems. They eat a lot of invertebrates, so they're important for pest and disease control. They're food for a lot of animals, potentially sources of pharmaceutical compounds, and they're of cultural significance to people all over the world. But they're threatened by a number of different factors, including invasive species, overexploitation for the pet trade or for meat, pollution, climate change, emerging infectious diseases, and often these threatening processes act synergistically to drive amphibian population declines. And we've known since the 1980s that amphibians are in trouble. So in the late 80s, the golden toad failed to emerge for its mass breeding. And even in pristine areas, amphibians disappeared. And it was for a number of years that scientists were trying to ponder what was happening to amphibians around the world. And ZSL's own Professor Andrew Cunningham from the Institute of Zoologists was part of an international team that finally made the link and had that eureka moment that amphibian chytrid fungi, which caused the disease amphibian chytridiomycosis, were driving amphibian population declines around the world. And this disease is like nothing conservation biologists had ever experienced before. It's driven the population declines of over 500 species. It's caused the recent extinction of over 90 species. And unfortunately, it's a disease we're unable to kind of mitigate in nature. So in terms of the range of hosts it infects and kills, it's unparalleled. And so because of this and other threats posed to amphibians, the fate of many species is completely dependent on the establishment of captive survival assurance colonies. And I'm just going to say conservation breeding programs because it's easier. And of the species that have been assessed in terms of their need for such a program, it's nearly 400 species so far that have been assessed that need this emergency rescue response. But as a global community, we just have capacity, or only 37 species are currently within these programs, and that's a real challenge. But what I think special and what attracted me to work at ZSL is the fact that, fine, you can rescue a species, but that's not recovering a species. We want to see these animals thriving in nature again. We need to understand how to restore habitats, how to maybe mitigate the impacts of disease, so these animals can go from beyond our zoos and thriving in nature. So these kind of interventions and the ex situ program needs to be embedded within a holistic kind of program for conservation where we're understanding and addressing the threats. So I'm going to talk to you about Darwin's frog. It's a tiny little frog, less than a gram in weight. And we've all heard how amazing Charles Darwin was as a naturalist, but he was a pretty terrible illustrator. This is Darwin's picture of Darwin's frog from the Voyage of the Beagle, but it does have some of the key characters there. So he was the first Western scientist to kind of report on the Darwin's frog. And there were originally two species of Darwin's frog. This is the northern Darwin's frog, which is critically endangered and likely extinct. It hasn't been seen since 1981. And the southern Darwin's frog, which is assessed as endangered. And both of these are found in the temperate rainforests of South America. So the southern Darwin's frog is found in Chile and a small part of Argentina. And what's really special about them is their reproductive biology. So Darwin's frogs lay eggs on the forest floor, and when the embryos develop, the male will take them up into his vocal sac where the tadpole develops. And when they're kind of developed to the stage that they're tiny little frogs, they're spat out. So we have a long history of about 15 years of working with Darwin's frogs. This is Claudio Soto-Azat, who did his MSc here at ZSL on wild animal health, and he looked at chytridiomycosis in amphibians in Chile. And he went on to do a PhD, which was co-supervised by Professor Andrew Cunningham. And together they've done a lot of research, published numerous papers on Darwin's frogs. And ZSL is also a partner on the binational conservation strategy for Darwin's frogs. And we've been working with Juanita de Darwin for a number of different years. And part of that work involves monitoring populations of Darwin's frogs. And there was one area in Parque Tantalco in Chile where there was a stronghold of Darwin's frogs, and there were 2 monitored populations there, and we found, and it was thought that these populations were free of the chytrid fungus. But in 2023, it was detected for the first time, and within a year, there was over a 90% population decline in those populations. And so it was widely discussed, and we needed to kind of mount an emergency response, which is where I became involved in the program. So there wasn't capacity to hold the frogs in Chile at the time, and so in consultation with the local community, an international team set out to try and save the last Darwin's frogs in these populations. And we could only export frogs that had a clean bill of health, and this involved swabbing them for chytrid fungi at the point of capture, and then getting these results, getting the swabs kind of transferred to a university. We got the results in 48 hours, and the frogs made their long journey back to London. And then in that time, we had about a month to develop the facilities for the frogs. And these frogs are held in isolation from all other amphibians that we hold here at the zoo, because we don't want to introduce any novel pathogens, because these animals, or their progeny, will hopefully be returning to the wild. The journey, the frogs travelled from the collection site by boat, and then by road to Santiago, and then by plane to London. About 13,000 kilometres, 52 hours, and this really took a lot of different people working together across institutions to make it happen. When the frogs arrived, they were again swabbed for chytrid fungi, they were given a clean bill of health, and they were transferred to the facilities here in London Zoo. And we tried to perfectly replicate the environment of the temperate rainforest, and that was involved incorporating data that were collected from the field, as well as data available in the literature, so we can provide them with all of the kind of seasonal regimes they need to thrive. And we've had some really good success so far. So several of the male frogs that were collected were, we say, pregnant, because Darwin's frogs are the only terrestrial vertebrate where there is a pregnancy in the male. So the tadpoles are actually sustained by the male while they're in the vocal sac. And we've had nearly 40 young born or reared. And then in Christmas 2024, we had the first eggs laid by frogs in the zoo, and these were successfully reared to metamorphosis. So really, really encouraging. And here's a tiny newborn Darwin's frog on a ruler for scale. But it's not just about the rescue of the Darwin's frog, it's about the recovery. So right now, what the team are doing is they're setting up fenced areas of habitat in Parque Tantalco, where these frogs were collected from. And the current thinking is that there are other species of amphibians that may be acting as reservoirs of infection. So in these fenced off areas, removing those other amphibians from those areas to hopefully facilitate, I guess, the recovery of Darwin's frogs within those areas, and also working with the population under human care at London Zoo to provide animals for future translocations, but also to undertake research and to validate methods that might be used in the field to recover populations. So this is an integrated program looking at the recovery. And this is just one of several different projects focusing on amphibians. So ZSL scientists and collaborators were the first to eliminate the chytrid fungus from several sites on the island of Majorca. This is the Majorca midwife toad, the target species. We worked with colleagues in the Natural History Museum of London and showed that chytrid fungi also infect and kill Sicilian amphibians, which are maybe new to many of you in the audience. They're a very weird group of amphibians. And we developed treatment protocols for chytrid infection. And ZSL and the wider mountain chicken recovery program responded to the catastrophic population declines of mountain chicken frogs in the Eastern Caribbean when chytrid arrived. So over 80 to 90% of mountain chicken frogs disappeared in about 18 months when chytrid fungus arrived there. These animals are managed as a stud book coordinated by Chester Zoo, and we work very closely with governments in the range states and Jersey Zoo to preserve this species. And right now, what we've been doing is manipulating habitat on Montserrat in fenced-off areas to make it less favourable for the chytrid fungus, but still favourable for the frogs. And that's an intervention that's currently ongoing. And these programs are bigger than the Darwin's frog and bigger than the mountain chicken frog. With these learnings, hopefully we will be empowered to try and drive the recovery of the 500 plus other amphibian species that are threatened with extinction. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. It's a bit of a cute animal off, but it's really important work that underlies these cute animals. And we're going from one organism where the males gestate the babies to another. Our third speaker is Professor Heather Koldewey. And it is not only the zoo's 200th birthday, but I've just found out that it is your 32nd birthday at the zoo. Started as a postdoc here at ZSL 32 years ago this very week. Now she's now head of Ocean and Fairer Conservation, and Heather is going to be talking about Project Seahorse.
Thanks very much for that introduction and making me feel very young. So I'm going to romp through 30 years of Project Seahorse, our first and longest standing marine conservation programme at ZSL, in 10 minutes. Not quite as many as amphibians, but 46 species of seahorses, the biggest about the size of your hand, the smallest smaller than your thumbnail. They live in the most vulnerable coastal habitats around the world, from about, if you draw a line south of Tasmania, right up to the UK, go through mangroves, estuaries, coral reefs, seagrass habitats. That's when you'll find seahorses. But it is their life history that's particularly appealing as a mother and interesting as a biologist, and that is that they mate for life, they form pairs, they do a little dance, courtship dance every morning to reinforce that bond. It's the male that gets pregnant and then gives birth to live miniature seahorses that look just like the adults. No further parental care involved. Now, while studying the biology of these animals and the reproductive strategies and understanding that better, Amanda Vincent, then at the University of Oxford, became aware through looking in various reference materials that there was something else going on. And she uncovered a global, enormous wildlife trade for seahorses. Dried for traditional medicine, particularly traditional Chinese medicine, live for aquarium fishes, and also as curiosities. And in 1990, she published the first estimate of the international trade in seahorses, involving millions of animals and multiple countries. And that's where we came involved at ZSL. Amanda came to give a talk. One of the challenges was seeing these giant piles of seahorses in markets in Hong Kong, was understanding the different species and where they came from. Now, at the time, I was in the Conservation Genetics Lab in the Institute of Zoology as a postdoctoral researcher. I actually skipped Amanda's talk to have lunch with a friend, but luckily a more dedicated colleague, Helen Stanley, attended the talk, and we followed up afterwards. How could we help with our genetic tools to unravel what was going on, to do some forensics of understanding this trade? And this led to PhD student Steve Casey, a bunch of genetic research, another student who worked on the morphometrics, and the first identification guide to seahorses. Amanda then moved to university in Canada, and really to make things simpler, we came up with calling ourselves Project Seahorse. She was getting told about this woman in the UK who was working on seahorses. I was hearing the same about her. And so we named ourselves Project Seahorse. So we don't actually exist as any kind of entity. We're a collaboration between the University of British Columbia in Canada and the Zoological Society in London. Now, when we established, we set up some pretty basic ways of approaches that have underpinned our work ever since. Firstly, always prioritizing conservation first. Secondly, recognizing that we're often making decisions with the best information available, and that shouldn't stop us from acting, particularly because the easiest thing to do as a scientist is to think that you could keep collecting more data and be hamstrung by that, by working in an imperfect world with imperfect information. And I think that's something that ZSL is really good at, is thinking about how we have the best scientific knowledge to act while filling those gaps as we go. The other part of our thinking is recognizing that for species conservation, we're in a much bigger system. So if we want to live in this onion world and save the seahorses at the center of that world, we need to look at the complex interactions at multiple levels surrounding that species, whether that's communities, national, or global pressures. When we started, there was almost nothing known about seahorses, and so we had to fill the gaps in other ways. And that was really looking at what was going on through the people who were collecting them. Now, at that time, the Philippines was the center of the seahorse trade, and we rebuilt history by looking at what the fishers' knowledge what the knowledge was about how seahorse populations had changed over time. And you don't need to do complicated statistics to see that populations were decreasing. And interestingly, the fishers had got the seahorses in pairs in the way that they put that together with no prompting. We also gained the perspectives of those same fishers on what would be the best management options to secure seahorses for the future. And the overwhelming recommendation from that group was to look at how we protect the ocean for seahorses, for other species too. So creating these banks, these fish banks where species could thrive. So community-managed marine protected areas. Over time, we started with one, the original seahorse site in this incredible double barrier reef system in the central Philippines, and expanded to support over 35 different community-managed marine protected areas in this area, while filling those knowledge gaps with the science, which ranged from understanding the community perceptions, looking at how the protected areas worked from a social level, to understanding what was happening underwater by reef surveys and understanding fish and seahorse populations. We also looked at some other aspects. I think my daughter might be watching this talk, and that's her. She's now a university student at Bristol. That's her as a baby, but with the women in the community, understanding how protected areas can disproportionately negatively affect women by being often placed where they glean for shells. So these kind of insights of how we make marine protected areas work for everyone in the community was pretty foundational. Now, this initial work in the Philippines led to expanding into our ZSL's work on mangroves and the registration of our ZSL Philippines office in 2015, but also led us to the challenges of sustaining conservation over time. We were really great with getting grants and support. We had volunteers helping with the monitoring, some of whom are here tonight. But how do we finance these in the long term? We actually established that through a very different approach, and that was recognizing the material value in some of the waste products in these remote communities. Recognizing nylon 6, what fishing nets are made of, is really high value, and establishing a net supply chain from these island communities to global markets. In this case, to make carpet, which you'll see in multiple exhibits in the zoo, and I'm standing on it now. But how we anchored the benefits in communities to support that marine protection, to provide that financing mechanism that was missing for sustainability. We have since diversified that business model into another market for seaweed and spun that out as a social enterprise that is a standalone enterprise called Coast for Sea that was nominated and a finalist for the Earthshot Prize in 2024. But back to the seahorses. How do we make sure they persist the long term in the wild, in these marine protected areas and beyond? And I touched on the global trade. Well, firstly, how do we take the pressure off wild populations? The aquarium trade was part of the problem. And this prompted us at ZSL to pioneer the first breeding programs for fish and aquatic invertebrates in Europe as part of the European Union Aquarium Curators in 1998, long after they were going for mammals and birds. And the collective with the amphibian, reptile, and invertebrate teams here at the zoo were particularly important in looking at how we do that in a different way. We didn't shy away from some of the difficult challenges in that. We've worked with the traditional Chinese medicine community since 1998, publishing materials in Chinese that were much more accessible and getting the full engagement and support of the Chinese medicine community in achieving sustainability in trade for seahorses, which work for them and work for us. And that was particularly prompted by a workshop supported by the traditional Chinese medicine community, led to all seahorses being listed under CITES, the global international trade mechanism that was implemented in 2002, the first for a marine fish. And what we've seen since then over time is that, combined with all the work we've done in the aquarium community to learn how to breed seahorses, is a decline in the live trade of seahorses and an increase of captive bred versus wild caught animals. The legal trade in dried seahorses has also decreased, but unfortunately, the illegal trade has increased. And a recent study showing what's being sold on the internet has highlighted a really significant black market for seahorses. And one of the challenges we faced, you may recognize this image coming from the recent amazing ocean documentary with Sir David Attenborough, is trawling. So seahorses sit on the bottom, they hang on to things, they are easily scooped up. This is a shrimp trawl. This is the biggest destroyer of seahorses as bycatch, a very valuable bycatch. So this means to save seahorses and manage the dry trade, we need to really tackle the destructive effects of bottom trawling. We're working at the global stage using seahorses as a model of how we manage wildlife trade for marine fishes. Most recently, one of my colleagues at Project Seahorse at the CITES meeting in Uzbekistan. And that cascades down to national plans of action. And we're still very active in the Philippines, led by ZSL's Chai Apale, who's leading the Philippine Seahorse Programme, known as Saving Mr. Mum. The challenge is that there's not that many of us. When we started off, we estimated there was about 15 scientists worldwide studying seahorses. And that led us to think of how do we pull that together most effectively. Through the IUCN, the World Conservation Union, we have a specialist group for seahorses and also their relatives. We've also developed tools. The iNaturalist platform that many of you likely use has an iSeahorse platform. And just a couple of weeks ago, we reached 20,000 observations on Seahorse, which have given us new insights into species biology, distribution, and how they're doing. And it's not just for biologists. Just at the end of last year, we launched Inspired by Iconic Fishes. How do we get more people excited about these incredible animals? Through art, music, dance, and any form of artistic expression. It's not just about working on these incredible animals. The main thing has been about the incredible people that we've got to work with, from the communities to the biologists, to the community organisers, and everybody involved in Project Seahorse, particularly the team who founded. And I'm very grateful to Amanda Vincent for her long commitment to seahorse conservation and working with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. I'm going to invite all three speakers to join me on the stage after the next one, so we can all have a conversation about the projects and about the history of the zoo and the ZSL itself. The final speaker before we do that is Professor Rosie Woodroffe, which you may have heard her on the radio being interviewed by me on a couple of occasions, talking about one of the two species that she works on, not African wild dogs, but badgers, and specifically their relationship to disease ecology and animal behaviour. So, Rosie, if you'd like to come, and welcome.
Thank you very much indeed. So ZSL is working to help wildlife and people thrive together. So you may be surprised to see that my opening slide has neither wildlife nor people in it. What has a wildlife organisation got to do with a disease of cattle? Well, we can add the people part immediately. Bovine tuberculosis is a huge problem for farmers in this country, like this one. But actually it's bigger than that. So going back in time, back in the early part of the last century, over 100 years ago, we recognised that bovine tuberculosis is a disease which can affect pretty much all mammals, including people. And this photograph of a child shows a classic lesion of bovine tuberculosis. This child's probably got infected by drinking unpasteurised milk at a time when 40% of herds in Great Britain were infected with TB. And about 1,500 people were dying each year so more people were dying of human TB, but bovine tuberculosis was a key cause of mortality. In fact, I just stumbled upon this, which I thought was interesting, that at that time in the 1930s, so in 1930, here at London Zoo on this very site, in the year 1930, an Indian fruit bat, a black buck, a sable antelope, a sun bear and a tiger all died of bovine tuberculosis. So you can see how this disease was so prevalent at that time. Moving forward in time, they got a grip on it, introduced ways of testing cattle, isolating farms that are affected, slaughtering affected cattle. And by the 1960s, the disease had been eradicated from most of Britain, except for a couple of pockets in the southwest, where the disease stubbornly didn't disappear in response to this. And they started to look for a wildlife source that might be allowing it to persist. And in 1971 found the first badger. And this is where the wildlife and the livestock and the people finally come together in the story. Pretty soon, within a couple of years of this first discovery of an affected badger, nice pictures like this were replaced with less nice pictures like this. So these men, you see that machine in the middle, that is pumping sodium cyanide powder into a badger set, a badger's underground burrow system. They were gassing badgers to try to kill them in order to try to stamp out bovine tuberculosis that they thought the badgers were carrying. And this was done on and around farms where cattle had turned out to have bovine TB. This was fantastically controversial. You're probably aware of this issue now. You know it's controversial today. It was just as controversial then. And in 1979, the then agriculture minister commissioned an independent scientific report to try and understand whether this gassing of badgers was the right thing to do. And this is where ZSL gets involved, because the person that he asked was Lord Zuckerman. You'll all have walked past his bust as you came into this room. He was then the president of ZSL. And a recognised authority on things to do with animals. So did he then, this sort of champion for animals, did he call for this to come to an end? Not a bit of it. This is what he recommended, that these control operations, including gassing, be resumed as soon as possible. This was highly controversial, leading to, for example, this unflattering cartoon of him doing some gassing of his own in private eye at the time. And the government followed what he said. They continued the gassing. Actually, later on welfare grounds, it was replaced by cage trapping and shooting badgers. And we don't know how many badgers were killed by gassing, because those badgers would have died underground and we can't be counted. But I've got post-mortem reports for nearly 20,000 badgers killed during this period of this localized culling of badgers that was being conducted in order to try to control bovine tuberculosis, to protect cattle and solve a big problem for farmers. The problem was, it didn't solve the problem. So this graph starts in 1980 and goes up to 1997, and you can see that during that time, I mean, the first impressive thing is that if you look at the y-axis, you can see that they've gone down from 40% of herds being affected to far below 1%. So that cattle testing really, really worked. And yet it hadn't got them down to eradication. And then over the course of the next sort of 15 years, that disease re-emerged from those areas which were still affected and spread out of southwest England across the country, despite the fact that in response to these outbreaks of TB in cattle, badgers were being killed again and again and again. The bit they hadn't done was the other thing that Zuckerman had recommended, which was that they should monitor the outcomes to discover whether this worked, to discover what effect badger control was having on TB in cattle and badgers. And they had to wait till 1997 for that. And that's where I got involved. So this is a thing called the randomized badger culling trial. It was a randomized controlled trial like you would run for a drug, except it involved wildlife. So here's a sort of southwestern kind of bit of Britain. More darker shading shows higher TB risk in cattle. And this had 3 experimental treatments. So there were 10 areas, each 100 square kilometers, where badgers were culled across that whole area. So not in a localized way, but, and that involved terrifying slaughter of nearly 9,000 badgers. There were another 10 areas which were randomly allocated to having localized culling, a lot like what had been done in the Zuckerman days. And then, for comparison, there were another 10 areas where there was no culling at all. And the idea was to compare these, look at what's the incidence of TB in cattle over time, and also test all the badgers for TB. So what happens when you cull badgers? Well, the first and most obvious thing is you go from having quite a lot of badgers to fewer. And you can see that happen in this graph, where before culling in blue, the 3 areas all look more or less the same. And then you can see where there's no culling, there's no change in the badgers. Where there's localized culling, you lose about 1/3 of the badgers. And where there's widespread culling, about 3/4 of the badgers are now gone. But badgers don't live in this sort of sea, this morass. They actually live in highly structured societies. They're highly clustered into little social groups. Each social group defends a territory fiercely. And that stops badgers from ranging widely across the countryside. And that's what you can see here is a whole load of badger territories mapped in the no culling area, one of the no culling areas. But when you cull, you destroy that system. Everything is messed up. There's no structure. There's nothing to stop me from kind of going over there because my neighbors aren't there anymore. And that's what you see happen here in one of these culling areas. Well, remember that we're doing this because these animals have got a disease, and because the badgers can't move very far, this badger that's been shaded in is supposed to have TB, and it's confined to that little area where that's shaded in pink, that shows just that territory has got tuberculosis. And when you cull, you allow more mixing of the badgers, and that leads to transmission of disease. A lot like under COVID, when we had lockdown, that was to stop this sort of mixing of people in just the same way. And in just as in that case, when you allow this mixing to happen within the badger population, you see disease transmission and the prevalence of infection goes up. So what this is telling you is that, for example, in those proactive culling areas, after 4 annual culls, the probability of a badger that's still alive there having TB has gone up 3-fold. And when we think about that in terms of then what the impact is on cattle, what we see is that when you cause those badgers to move more widely, each one of them is meeting more cattle. So badgers culling then has going to have two impacts, but they oppose each other. One is that there's fewer badgers, and if you're trying to control the disease that badgers carry, that's a good thing. The numbers are kind of in the benefit. But each remaining badger is more infectious, and there's 2 reasons for that. One is it's more likely to have TB, and also it's traveling more widely, so it's going to meet more cattle. So the numbers are kind of trading off against the behavioral effects of culling. So what does that mean in terms of impacts on cattle? Well, that trade-off between how many badgers there are and what they're doing depends on how many badgers you kill. So if you kill a lot of badgers, that's what happened in these widespread culls. And there we saw cattle TB fall relative to the areas which weren't culled. But if you don't kill so many badgers, and that's what happened in these localized culling areas and by accident around the edge of the areas where the large-scale culls, there we saw, in both cases, TB in cattle go up rather than down. Now remember that the culling that Zuckerman was recommending was localized, and it may help to explain why TB re-emerged in the first place, because the cattle restrictions had been relaxed and badger culling was possibly spreading the disease around. Now, I interpret this one way. I look at these data, and I did at the time, and said, do you know what? Very large culls can perhaps reduce cattle TB to some extent, but that happens at the expense of there being more TB in cattle on neighbouring land. So on balance, there's no net benefit. And anyway, we're trying to eradicate this disease, and badger culling doesn't do that because it causes the disease to spread within the badger population even as the badger numbers go down. So we made a recommendation that badger culling couldn't really usefully contribute to TB control. Government saw it another way. We said, well, you see these harmful effects on neighbouring land, and government said, yeah, what if there was no neighbouring land? We live on an island. We can cull coast to coast. And that's what they did. I don't know if you can see the percentages in here, but 80–90% of the land area of different counties across the south and southwest of England being set aside under culling licenses for year after year. They killed nearly 250,000 badgers up to the end of 2024. Don't have 2025 data yet. Quietly in the middle of all of this, a paper came out using the samples that were collected from those badgers and cattle in the randomized badger culling trial, used modern molecular genetics, which we didn't have at the time, which showed that for every case of TB that a cattle herd gets from badgers, there are 17 that they get from other cattle. So most TB is cattle-to-cattle transmission, badgers just playing a small part of that. So in parallel with this, we started in a little bit of Cornwall, where there was no culling, started a project, the Cornwall Badger Project, looking at alternatives. So a whole load of different things, but the key part I want to quickly tell you about is about badger vaccination. We were collaring badgers for other reasons. We started vaccinating badgers. We were able to show that whilst culling changes badgers' behavior and causes disease to spread around, vaccination has no effect on their behavior at all. So that was nice. But also, when we were vaccinating badgers, we'd also taken blood samples. We could test them for TB. And what we saw in one of our areas, the best sampled area, was as you repeat, when you repeat culling, TB in the badgers go up. When you repeat vaccination, TB in the badger populations goes down. So that was lovely. That's what we expect, of course, but it's good to see it. We shared the results with farmers. Farmers are absolutely thrilled. So they were, not that keen on vaccination when we started, and they were really keen on vaccination by the time we finished. We shared this with local farmers. We were kind of telling people about this local success. And then I was thrilled then, surprised but thrilled, to get a call from the National Farmers Union. National Farmers Union came to see us. These are the people who were the architects of the badger cull. We showed them what we were doing, and pretty soon, as of last year, we've launched a project jointly with the National Farmers Union where we're trying to replicate these successes and see what role that badger vaccination can play, and farmers are now learning to do the vaccination themselves. So for years, I've finished talks with this picture. It was obviously intended to show how big a badger cub is relative to a kilo of sugar. But I liked it because it says at the bottom, working with UK farmers. And I've been saying for a long time that that's what we hoped for. Finally, we're doing it. Actually, we're not just doing that. We're not just working with farmers. Now we're working with government, because when the new government came in, they announced that they would revisit the TB eradication strategy. They're doing it in a co-designed way. And so we're now literally writing the policy with the National Farmers Union, with the Royal Veterinary College, all this, and with government. So this new strategy, which will be coming out in a few months, will be a new way, focusing primarily on cattle with some badger vaccination. And hopefully, that should be the end of the badger cull, I'm hoping. Thanks very much.
Thank you to all of the speakers. I think you really get a sense of the range of the project here at ZSL and the zoo. I want to start by asking Izzy, just to go back to the history, that it's really interesting that Raffles sets this up as a really practical, scientific project. I wonder if you could expand on that, because it's very apparent that that is still what ZSL and the Institute of Zoology are doing.
I mean, it's interesting because there was a lot of debate at this point. You know, it was Raffles that was really pushing for it to be about science, because, you know, just hearing you talking about UK farmers, there was a big contingent at this point that wanted it to be, you know, in the quote I showed about being useful. You know, so there was lots of kind of, you know, they were trying to appeal to basically people who had money and these rich kind of landed gentry. And so, you know, there was this arm of the society that was going to be about being useful for, you know, not farmers, but people who had estates. They wanted to, like, you know, can we breed nicer birds for our table? Can we breed faster dogs and stuff? But yeah, but Raffles, you know, was dogged in that he wanted it to be about science. And, you know, I guess our understanding of what that means is very different today to what that meant then. You know, in terms of, I don't think we'd see it in keeping with the ZSL's ethos today, that they literally just went and captured wild animals from around the globe and talk about illegal trade. I mean, very much involved the illegal trade. But I think for that time, you know, he stuck to it. He fought against a lot of opposition that wanted very different aims for society. And, you know, he did, hopefully, would be pleased to see where it's all ended up today.
Yeah. I'm going to open it up to the audience in a couple of minutes, but I'm just going to hog the questions because I have many. But another thing that you mentioned, Izzy, was about how this Raffles and the setting up of the zoo in 1826 was effectively an imperial project. It was part of the return of animals from these new explored places by the West. But for you three as researchers, in some ways you are still working with indigenous communities in a way that when the zoo was set up was entirely different. I wonder if you could talk about your engagements with, well, indigenous researchers and people in the places for frogs and seahorses, but also with farmers in Cornwall. Ben, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think times have changed. So I talked about the collection of Darwin's frogs, for example, the collection of mountain chicken frogs, but none of those animals are actually owned by the zoo. They're all owned by the government of Montserrat, for example. So we report to those agencies on how the frogs are doing, you know, is the population increasing, and so on. And yeah, local partnerships have been key in all of the conservation projects on amphibians that I've been involved in, often sharing skills, sharing insights, so we can work together to recover the threatened species. And often it's more about us providing the scientific evidence for local people to make their own decisions about wildlife. So we kind of provide the data that will facilitate that decision making.
And Heather, I wonder if you could also comment on that, because you are bringing these projects from London to the places where people are working on them, and the sort of long-term strategy of the local communities continuing your work.
I think a key element of Project Seahorse was the first trip to the Philippines, which Amanda made. She met a local NGO called the Haribon Foundation, who said, don't start by going into communities with biologists. You need to have community organisers, or what we would call social workers, or community mobilisers. And so Maravik Pahara, who was in that picture at the beginning of us with Project Seahorse, which was an oversight to mention her, because she was phenomenally influential in saying, right, this is a people, we need to start with the communities and the people. And that was really foundational. So our teams have always been a mix, and that is still the same today, of both biologists, but also community organisers are really central. And that's making sure that and all of the ZSL Philippines team and Project Seahorse in the Philippines has always been Philippine-led, and all of the team are Filipino. And it's a technical advice role and a technical support role that the international team are playing. So the leadership is coming from the Philippines. And it is a big shift that has taken place in conservation, where we talk about, and science, where we talk about parachute science or parachute conservation. We talk about white saviour syndrome, where we go in and try and, fix everything. And part of my role in the conservation team here is leading our fairer conservation initiative, which is just that. How do we shift that whole process to one where it's community, not just community-based, but community-led? And in many ways, that is putting us and potentially our role on a route to phase out. And it's certainly enabling the local leadership and supporting the local leadership. And if you look at our programs like our Edge Fellowship program that Ben touched on, that's exactly that. An amazing colleague of mine from Sri Lanka said, that talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. And I think one of our roles at ZSL is to create those opportunities through things like the Edge Fellowship program. But if we're very firmly looking at how we build that local leadership, how we enable, and how we look at science more than just a lab coat and a graph, but that local knowledge, the traditional knowledge and cultural heritage is all a critical part of conservation, and that's what's going to make the difference for the future.
Yeah, I've worked with Indigenous people in the Americas and in New Zealand, and one of the things which is now documented and has been published on is that the richness of data is far greater when Indigenous projects local projects are owned and led by Indigenous people anyway. And so apart from wanting to engage in a much, so it doesn't look colonial, it doesn't look like white saviour, but actually those projects which are politically motivated also produce better data as well. But you have to be willing to engage slowly and carefully and not in a ham-fisted way. Rosie, some of your work has been, as you've mentioned, very controversial. It's a controversial area. You've been involved in serious disputes over the last 20 years. How important is that engagement, particularly with farmers, for your work with badgers? I
think it's absolutely central. I think with the Badger Project, it's been, there's this idea that you speak truth to power, and I spent a long time talking to politicians, and then of course the government changes and the policy changes, and you're back to square one. So I stopped doing that and started talking to farmers instead, because after all they own the land, and it's their decision what they do on their land, legally or illegally. And I realised that we weren't going to be able to make a difference unless we did it from the grassroots. And so that's what we did, gave up, and actually have kind of then come back to to policy advising again, but from a different, from sort of rising from the bottom rather than kind of just start. I mean, I started as 30 years old, going and sort of telling people what to do. Trust me, I've got a PhD, and it works for some people, but it certainly doesn't work for farmers. I think one of the things which has been really powerful is using science as a bridge, because if you do that, trust me, I've got a PhD. I'm an expert. I know more than you. That doesn't work. But if you go in and say, honestly, I don't know the answer to this question. I would say to farmers, I don't know how well badger vaccination works. And I can't find out on my own because I don't own any cows and I don't have any land. I need you to help me, but we'll do it together. And it was by doing that, by involving them in the decision-making and sharing the data and seeing the results emerge gradually, like scientists do, that made them such keen advocates for the approach. So I think science has a really powerful role in involving people as a way of bringing people in and kind of finding a way through these controversial and difficult topics.
So a big part of your work, and I suppose this is the same for all three of you, is sort of diplomacy and not charging in with your big science boots on and saying, well, we do know more than you guys. It's about engaging with local communities.
Yeah, I think it's much more about knowing how to find out than the answer.
So when you got that call from the National Farmers Union,
yeah.
How surprised were you?
Stunned. But delighted. But I mean, we do the same thing. So as you mentioned, I also work on African wild dogs, and I should tell you that I started a project in Kenya 25 years ago, and about 5 years ago handed it over, so it's now Kenyan-led. So I'm a sort of external advisor to that now. But we've done work with local communities, very different, but this is an animal which will come in and kill goats, for example, and that's people's livelihoods. They surplus kill, they're quite difficult to live with sometimes. And again, people hate them because this is a very successful predator. And we kind of did the same thing. We went in and said, look, what do I know about how to look after goats? Nothing. Grew up in Cornwall. But I do know how to help you as a community learn, and we go in, and every time the wild dogs attack the goats, we go in and ask them what they were doing and how the goats were being looked after, and then we go and ask other people who weren't attacked, and using that sort of scientific approach, comparing the two, we don't ask anyone to change anything, we just help them learn from their own experience. And again, that's been really, really successful because it's kind of grassroots coming from them.
Can I just say, because it's interesting listening to you talking about raffles and the sort of scientific approach, but, these people are obviously starting from a very, very low baseline, but they did employ these same methods of why are all the animals in the zoo dying? Let's do an experiment. And so starting experiments in feeding, this in the 1830s. Do we heat the dens? Do we cool the dens? Do they need fresh air? Do they, it was science-led, even though from this very different position, right from the very beginning.
Was there any evidence that back in the day, back in the 19th century, that they were using what we now refer to as indigenous expert knowledge? Did they ever consult?
Yeah. I mean, the giraffes I spoke about, they bought the Egyptian hunters that had helped them capture them and then cared for them in captivity. They brought them over and got them to teach the keepers in London Zoo how to look after these animals. I mean, I'm sure it's not in the same way. It's it was we're talking about the colonial mindset, but it was definitely using that knowledge that they had, that they recognised they didn't have over here.
A question for Heather. Well, it's two-parter. What is the? I don't know what the trade for dried seahorses is for. Is that part of the Chinese medicine? Okay. So the follow-up question is, what was it like engaging with that community? I've never heard of that type of engagement before, which is an incredible source of conservation disasters and illegality.
Yeah, it was really interesting and surprising, I think. At that point in time, there was a lot of the trade was running through Hong Kong, and a lot of it was a group, sort of one group of traders who were managing most of the trade. And so we could actually have a conversation, a very influential conversation with quite a small group of people. And Of course, the objectives are still the same. They wanted seahorses forever. We want seahorses forever. So we had a shared goal. And when we asked them, they said, well, how long do you think we should plan for if we're going to have this discussion? And we were like, well, you know, we got a year of funding, we might get 3. And they said, because we probably think in this case we'll plan for 50 years. We'd normally like to plan for 100. And we're going, oh my God, we got 1 year of funding. And then they said, well, you know, if there's ideas you've got on sustainability and how we can guarantee the trade, you know, what should we do? Because we can decide that today. So obviously, you know, that never happens. And so we were on the spot going, you know, what are we going to do? So we said, well, what about not trading pregnant male seahorses? Because we were like, that's trading all the babies and the dads. And so they said, yeah, okay, fine, done. And so, so we were like, it wasn't that hard. But then we quickly had to then do the research to then see, and obviously you're then selecting just half of the breeding pair. So we then shifted the recommendation around size. So allowing seahorses to breed and to work above a certain size, and that's now part of the approach that we use with the trade is trade regulation, because seahorse species are hard to identify. So they were, when we talked even about CITES and introducing that, they said, well, it's more paperwork, but you know, there's more paperwork with everything these days. So if it's helping us towards sustainability, so it was sharing that same goal. And most interactions with conservationists had been, we're down to the last 2,000. But all of the literature had been published in English. They had no clue. So the fact that there was a dialogue, a shared conversation to look at solutions, and we were looking at sustainability and trade versus a ban, because we're not down to the last 2,000, gave us a completely different route for conversation.
I think that's it's fascinating that engagement with a community which I think often in conservation circles is regarded as the enemy, resulted almost instantaneously in a positive solution. Ben, I wanted to ask you about if you had significant challenges like that in your work with the Darwin's frogs.
Not so much with the Darwin's frog, but other species of amphibians that we've worked with. The Chinese giant salamander is a species we've been working on for, I guess, a couple of decades now, and that's a species which is farmed for meat in China. So trying to engage with the farming industry in the conservation of the Chinese giant salamander and finding common ground was quite insightful. So, you know, realizing that these farmers had an incredible skill set to offer. So, for example, one of the conservation, I guess, recommendations we made is there are multiple species of Chinese giant salamander, and that these should be, because populations are really, really small of some of these species, that conservation breeding is required in China. And it will be the farmers that teach us how to breed salamanders in these conservation breeding centres in China. So, yeah, using their expertise to have a positive conservation outcome, hopefully, in the future.
Okay. I'm going to open it up to the floor. So we've got some rules about this. There are people with microphones. So I want you to put your hands up and wait for a microphone to come to you. Questions are single sentences that end with an upwards inflection. And one more rule that I introduced, the paper was published in 2015, which showed that in talks after scientific events, if women ask questions first, then the audience ratio for questions is 50-50. Whereas if men ask questions first, it is 80-20 in favour of men. So, questions alternating between women and men. Sir, you can go second.
Thank you for the amazing talks. My question is something that you've all kind of touched on, which is about financing. Because I imagine that a lot of the funding for projects kind of come from either as government funded or like NGOs and educational institutions. But, you know, London Zoo had a successful breeding program of rhinos in Africa, and they got like a rhino like rhino bond for private investors, and I wonder to what extent can we like make more use of kind of money from private investors to fund these projects.
Okay, I'm not sure who is that question most appropriate for, but Heather.
I can. I mean, I think diversifying the sources of income is obviously, particularly in these economic times, is something that ZSL is spending a lot of time on. We have a sustainable business and finance team that have taken that rhino bond model and are looking at different versions of that, as well as other sort of innovative forms of finance. With Project Seahorse, we had support from Gillian Chocolates, which was fantastic. My best talk ever was giving it in a chocolate factory in Belgium, but that was as part of their marketing budget because they obviously have seahorse-shaped chocolates, and that was an amazing partnership that ran for over a decade. The first thing, as a biologist, though, we had to tell them that the seahorse tail goes the wrong way round, and that was awkward. But they then ran a competition in Belgium for kids to say, how did the Gillian seahorse get its tail the wrong way round, which was a wonderful solution.
But did they change it? Have they changed it?
No, they didn't. No, they didn't.
Well, there's work to be done there.
The chocolates are still great. So, yeah.
Okay, gentleman on the front row here.
Yeah, Ben, I think, well, definitely. A couple of decades ago, I was at a lot of meetings on amphibian conservation, and we were going to absolutely cover the zoo car parks with shipping containers.
Yeah.
Each one would have a species that was going to be, biocontrolled. Clearly, that's not happened, and I'm very sad. This is not a criticism. So, do you think that working in habitat, species can be saved without the need for captive populations? Might we ever get there?
I think
Perfectly delivered. Thank you.
It depends on the species, the context, and the threat. I would be very sad if we had a car park full of shipping containers full of amphibians, because I talked about mountain chickens and Darwin's frogs. The only reason we have those frogs here is because there wasn't capacity in the range countries at that specific time to develop the conservation breeding program there. And in my opinion, that would always be the right way to do it. I think there's several projects we're involved in at the moment where the emphasis is on supporting local teams to develop conservation breeding programs in other parts of the world.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Regarding like chytridiomycosis and the conservation breeding plans, after the animals have been bred in captivity and they're going to get released, how will that work considering that chytrid persists in the environment for a very long time? Like, what mitigation practices are being put in place to get rid of the fungus in the habitats?
Yeah, that's...
Gotta love a zoo audience.
No, that's a good question, and that's the challenge that's been set before us. So we can treat individual amphibians for infection quite easily. So for the mountain chicken frog I mentioned earlier, the chytrid fungus is sensitive to high temperatures and desiccation. So it might be, we're seeing in some parts of Australia where amphibian populations within rainforests have declined, but on the edge of rainforest, where it's slightly hotter and drier, those species are persisting. So it's about looking at things like that and trying to kind of exploit it for our benefit for conservation, if you like. So, yeah, it could be habitat manipulations. It could be that we've seen species that people thought were extinct have miraculously been rediscovered. So what is it about those populations that have meant that they've persisted when other species have died out? So it is really kind of at the cutting edge of science. There are things and avenues where we're exploring all the time, and I just sincerely hope that I guess the science catches up so we can really safeguard those species going forward. But it is a huge challenge because maintaining species to such a high level of management in biosecure facilities is really, really labour intensive and expensive as well. So the best case scenario is we're seeing that these animals are recovering in nature and not under human care at all.
I want to sort of follow on from that question in asking you that you all work on projects which are quite, well, they're about specific species or specific genera that you could sort of look at them as being quite esoteric. How sort of scalable in terms of what you have learned from Darwin's frogs or from the seahorses or from badgers, how does that translate into a broader picture of conservation? Is it very specific to your frogs or seahorses or badgers, or do you learn lessons which then become normalised amongst any conservation project?
Well, maybe I can go first. I mean, I think there are general lessons to learn. So, for example, so I work with African wild dogs. They are also impacted by infectious diseases, especially rabies and canine distemper virus. And that was it's taken 20 or 30 years to figure out how to protect that species from those diseases. So it's very different from an environmental disease like chytrid. But having kind of gone through that, the disease management guidelines that we've developed for that species then provide a really valuable blueprint for other endangered species threatened by, in that case, viral diseases. So I think that's one of the useful things about science is that you're able to draw more general conclusions, even if you're working on in that case on one species. Certainly, I mean, I've learned a huge amount just about how to, at a higher level, how to engage with people, with policymakers, with communities, by working both in Africa and Britain. It's one of the reasons I continue to do both, because actually, in the ways of working, also there's a huge amount of crossover, because farmers in Cornwall are really no different from farmers in Kenya, and the way that you interact with them, the way you work with them is really quite similar. People are people all over the world.
Okay, I'm going to go to the last question before we run out of time. The gentleman here. See, it works. 50-50. Science.
First of all, thank you to all the speakers. Wonderful talks. And if you know anything about me, this next question is going to be out the blue because it's not about amphibians. Sorry, Ben. This is for Isobel. So if I remember correctly, unfortunately, Raffles died shortly after the foundation of ZSL. So how did the society weather that turbulent start? Was it the shared, vision of the men amongst them, and could have been a different situation where we wouldn't be here 200 years later celebrating that very moment?
I think he'd got far enough is the answer. I can't remember when exactly he died, but he'd set up the society. He'd kind of enshrined their principles in their, in the prospectus they'd all signed up to, and he'd got the land. He'd hired the architect to build it, and I think he'd done enough to set it in motion. And the people that had joined him were people that shared what his vision were. I mean, throughout the early decades, and I'm sure it's the same now, there's, huge tensions between various, the people that just wanted to have let's create a great attraction for the public and make loads of money by inviting visitors, and the people that were really, harder on the science. But I think, he'd done enough. It's just a great tragedy that he didn't really get to see it. His wife, interestingly, was became a fellow of the ZSL. I think she was the first female fellow. So she did see what he'd created and sort of continued to be a part of that.
Your book is a superb explanation of all that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's nice.
Buy Izzy's book. Final question from me. So we're talking about the history of the zoo, but also the projects that you're working on live at the moment. What is the future? What's the next 200 years? When we sit on this stage in 20, maths.
Might not be us, but...
What are they going to be talking about?
They're all looking at me.
Well, I thought we were going to go down.
I think, well, I mean, I'd like to say something cheerful. I hope I can think of something cheerful, because I think, we do a lot of work on climate change, and, just in the next, 30, 40 years, the African wild dog, for example, is really going to be in trouble. And so I think there's a huge challenge for the people, coming now and after us and generations after, to maintain these species and these, ecological communities in the face of all the environmental change that's happening. I hope that we'll still be able to talk about field conservation, and it won't be a whole load of shipping containers and biosecure units to keep, to retain these fragments. But I'm not sure, to be honest, what we're going to achieve, I'm afraid.
Nice. Yeah. I think my view is the most innovative solutions come from bringing more sectors together. So I think what started as a group of, white men with a zoological vision, sort of supported by science. I'll stick with the supported by science, but I think the solutions are in very different places and very different sectors. I think there is a big opportunity and drive to push to locally led conservation, and as you said, the results are there to show that if that's supported, that works, and a very high percentage of sustainability and success. I think seeing more sectors, sustainable business, technology, AI, all of these things used in the right way are a very positive future. It cannot just be zoologists, the Zoological Society of London, and the handful of, if you look at NGOs around the world, all of us together working in the conservation sector, we don't even feature on the list of businesses. So add in universities and it shifts us up a bit, but not that much. So it has to be a different set of people around the table creating solutions. We've seen finance, we've seen insurance, we've seen a diversity of sectors coming into the conservation space in recent years. And I think there are, amongst some of the dominant narratives we hear now, there is a very big, different narrative. And it obviously is on the balance, but I'm an eternal optimist. So I'm going to say that it's going to be tip in the right direction.
Well, let's end on that. There's two notes of hope from the scientists on the panel. I hope you enjoyed tonight. There are 5 more of these events celebrating the 200th anniversary of the zoo and the Zoological Society of London and the Institute of Zoology and all the wonderful things they've been doing for the last 200 years. The next one is on the 10th of March. The Wild Talks event will be looking at women in wildlife. That won't be hosted by me because I'm neither a woman nor work in wildlife. But do look on the website for that information. 10th of March for women in wildlife, and then 4 more after that. That is all for tonight. I would just like to ask you to thank my guests again tonight, Izzy, Ben, Heather, and Rosie. Thank you very much.